when I was listening to Hadani describe Baghdad today, I was thinking, with all due respect to what the Iraqi people suffer every day, we have a bit of a Baghdad light under construction here in Toronto, a temporary green zone, if you will, for the next week, for a week to 10 days, complete with the fortified wall where the powerful people get together and make their deals, the overwhelming security presence, the limited mobility of people in the city, the restrictions and repressions of journalists and people trying to just take pictures of the security fence. There's already been reports of photos being forcibly deleted and arrests threatened by journalists and others just taking pictures of the fence that is so grotesquely blocked off a big chunk of your city here. So I think this is the world that they want to create for us. The people inside those walls is a world of green zones. And Baghdad and Iraq is the most extreme example, but they need to fence themselves off from the rest of us because of what their policies and what they do to us, what they've done to the people of the world and what they've done to the world's, to the earth, to the ecology. They need to wall themselves off and fortify themselves because they're facing resistance all over the world. And I hope we see a lot of that this week in Toronto. I came to Afghanistan through my involvement in the anti-war movement, which actually started, what got me serious as an activist was the Second Intifada, which was the Palestinian uprising that started in the year 2000. The inspiration of people fighting back with bare hands, with rocks and stones against the fourth most powerful military in the world. And from there I became involved in Iraq, in the movement before the Iraq War. And then naturally the anti-war movement has focused so much of our energy in recent years on Afghanistan. And in terms of my journalism, through editing rabble.ca and other endeavors, always trying to bring a focus to what Canada was doing in Afghanistan. Very few independent reporters from Canada have been to Afghanistan at all over the last 8 or 9 years. We've lost one of the best journalists working in the mainstream media as a regular correspondent from Afghanistan, and I'll talk about that in a second. We haven't lost him completely, but he's no longer working from Afghanistan. And then I also had the good fortune to meet Malalai Joya and collaborate with her on her book, A Woman Among Warlords. If you haven't heard about it or haven't read it, it's kind of, I could plug it as the kind of anti-reading Lolita in Tehran, anti-infidel, by, not that there isn't literary value in Azar Nafisi's books, but reading Lolita in Tehran and Infidel are kind of emblematic and kind of kickstarted a whole genre of Muslim women liberation fiction and memoir, both. And so I think a lot of publishers, this book, Malalai Joya's book, has been published in I think at least 15 countries now. And I think, frankly, several publishers have probably been a little hoodwinked as to what it would, what its message would be. But this whole genre of Muslim women's liberation publishing has really almost invariably been the story of a woman in a Muslim society who has to flee her culture, not flee from imperialism and the reactionary elements in her society, but really flee from her culture or be liberated in the sense of taking off the hijab, taking off the niqab, and most often moving to the West. Almost every single person that hears about Malalai Joya and sees that she has a book out, they assume she's living in Canada or living somewhere else in exile. She is sort of the last person that would ever consider exile, would ever consider a comfortable life in the West. So she's very much representative of a woman in a Muslim society who is fighting against the fundamentalist elements and the extremist elements within her society, but over and above that, and along with that, she's fighting and bringing a clear message against imperialism and the destruction that the Western governments have wrought to her country in particular. So that's just, I won't get into what's in the book and Malalai Joya's story, but she was a member of parliament, if you can believe it, in the puppet government they set up. They included a parliament which never had any real power, but they did allow some independents to get elected. For the most part, it was just warlords, other stooges of Karzai and NATO. But the odd independent did get elected. So in 2005, as a 27-year-old, Joya was elected to the parliament for Farah province. And in 2005, she was elected to Parliament. In less than 2 years, she was thrown right out of Parliament for supposedly insulting the dignity of her fellow parliamentarians. But the truth was that she had compared the Parliament to a zoo or a stable because of the killers and the war criminals in that Parliament. But she was her free speech was violated. She was thrown out. She was banned. There were a number of assassination attempts. And this is just what happens to women who speak up in Afghanistan under NATO and the Karzai regime. And this is what happens to social activists in general in Afghanistan. So all of that to say, you know, not just Joya, but all Afghan voices that are struggling in Afghanistan. It's really one of our duties as alternative media, one of our key jobs, I think, is to amplify what they're already saying, what they're already putting out there. Sometimes that'll mean translating it to make it available for English. Other times it'll just mean distributing it through our networks. So I think that's an essential task. I wanted to give a plug to this mainstream journalist who's no longer a regular correspondent in Afghanistan, just because I think it's an interesting case study of how the corporate media works. Graham Smith, people probably familiar with his work, a lot of you. He was a regular correspondent in Kandahar for the Globe and Mail. For I think at least 3 or 4 years he was in Kandahar a good portion of the time. He was quite relentless in breaking the torture scandal, in exposing some of the Canadian government cover-up in terms of what they knew about the torture that was going on in Kandahar. But I started to notice last year that he wasn't filing regularly from Kandahar. And I never saw in the Globe and Mail what happened to him. I didn't see a notice. But I dug it up on a website in the fall. It turned out he was actually told by a high-ranking member of Afghan intelligence services that he should get the heck out of Kandahar. His life was in danger because he had been asking a lot of questions about actually one of the anti-corruption officials, one of the officials who's supposed to be cracking down on opium trafficking, but of course was very much complicit in the trade and the business. And so Smith was advised to leave if he valued his life. So he did leave, and today he's stationed for the most part in South Asia, based in Delhi and other parts in India. Now, I don't have time to give you his whole bio, but basically he was, as he describes it, as I've seen him describe it in interviews, he was just someone willing to take on a risky assignment. He didn't have a lot of seniority in the field, but I think he went and really excelled. He filed a lot of honest stories. Who knows what got left in the Globe and Mail's editorial floor, what got cut that he did file, but he did a lot of excellent work. And when he was threatened, as far as I know, no one came to bat for him, no one came and offered extra security or any other measures to make sure he could continue to do his reporting. So he's filed some stories that have been very important in the last year. He broke a story that, as far as I know, didn't get anywhere else, called The House of Pain. It was entitled The House of Pain, headline House of Pain, in the Globe and Mail, and they let him publish this one. It described how the former governor of Kandahar, Governor Khalid, had actually been carrying out torture of detainees in the governor's palace in Kandahar city. And that, more importantly, Canadian guards were supporting the palace guard, were part of the palace guard when this torture was taking place. And the Canadians knew what was happening, what the governor himself was doing, and what other Afghan security forces were doing. So if you're wondering why the people of Kandahar have turned against NATO, if you're wondering why this planned offensive of NATO didn't really roll out like it was supposed to this June, if you're wondering why, if you heard the news that by a ratio of 19-1, Kandaharis prefer negotiation with the Taliban and other insurgents to the NATO offensive, if you're wondering what's gone off the rails for NATO in Kandahar, it's this type of just blatant torture and blatant complicity from the foreign forces, very notably Canada, probably second only to the US in Kandahar in terms of their presence over the past years. Actually, only recently they've been really flooded out by US Marines, so now they're a lesser force there.